Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Great Captains, showing the influence on the art of war of the campaigns of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Frederick, and Napoleon, by Theodore A. Dodge. Hannibal.
2 generations after the death of Alexander, the power of the Mediterranean world was divided between Aryan Rome and Carthage, the vigorous daughter of Semitic Tyre. Carthage was first on the sea, Rome on land. But Rome, always intolerant of powerful neighbors, fell to quarreling with her great rival, and at the end of a 23-year struggle, the First Punic War imposed her own terms on defeated Carthage, 241 BC. There were 2 parties bred of these hostilities in Carthage: the war party, headed by Hamilcar Barca, the peace party, headed by Hanno. Hamilcar knew that peace with Rome meant oppression by Rome and final extinction, and was ready to stake all on renewing the struggle. But he saw that present war was impossible, that opposition could only be in the future, and that it must be quietly prepared for. With a view of doing this, Hamilcar got the consent of the Carthaginian Senate to attempt the subjugation of Spain, a land of great natural resources, in conquering and holding which an army could be created, which by and by might again cope with the Italian tyrant. The Carthaginian fleet had been destroyed. Rome would not permit the building of a new one. Hamilcar's army was obliged to march overland from Carthage along the north coast of Africa and ship across the strait, now Gibraltar. This was a bold thing to do, but it succeeded, and in a series of campaigns, Hamilcar reduced the southern half of Spain, and BC 236 to 227 firmly planted the Carthaginian power there. So conciliatory as well as vigorous had been his policy that, on his death, the native tribes elected Hasdrubal, his son-in-law, general-in-chief of the allied Carthaginian and Spanish forces, which then amounted to nearly 70,000 men and 200 elephants. Hasdrubal continued the policy of Hamilcar and largely increased the Spanish influence and territory. But as Rome had colonies in northern Spain, the 2 powers were sure soon again to clash. In fact, Rome, after a while, woke up to this new danger and notified Carthage that she would extend her colonies north of the Ebro at her peril. Hannibal was the son of Hamilcar. His father gave him the best Greek education, and this the lad's remarkable intellect readily assimilated. He trained him to arms under his own eye. Hannibal received his first schooling as a soldier at the age of 9 in his father's camps in Spain, and later his brother, Hasdrubal, made him his chief of cavalry at the age of 21. A pen picture by Hannibal's arch-enemy, Livy, tells us what he then was. No sooner had he arrived than Hannibal drew the whole army towards him. The old soldiers fancied they saw Hamilcar in his youth given back to them. The same bright look, the same fire in his eye, the same trick of countenance and features. But soon he proved that to be his father's son was not his highest recommendation. Never was one and the same spirit more skillful to meet opposition, to obey, or to command. It was hard to decide whether he was more dear to the chief or the army. Neither did Hasdrubal more readily place anyone at the head when courage or activity was required, nor were the soldiers under any other leader so full of confidence and daring. He entered danger with the greatest mettle, he comported himself in danger with the greatest unconcern. By no difficulties could his body be tired, his ardor damped. Heat and cold he suffered with equal endurance. The amount of his food and drink was gauged by natural needs and not by desire. The time of waking and sleeping depended not on the distinction of day and night. What time was left from business he devoted to rest, and this was not brought on by either a soft couch or by quiet. Many have often seen him covered by a short field cloak lying on the ground betwixt the outposts and sentinels of the soldiers. His clothing in no wise distinguished him from his fellows. His weapons and horses attracted every one's eye. He was by long odds the best rider, the best marcher. He went into battle the first, he came out of it the last. Hannibal served 3 years under Hasdrubal's supreme command, and left nothing unobserved, which he who desires to become a great leader ought to see and to do. Hannibal and his brothers had been brought up with an intensity of hatred of Rome, which it is hard to describe. Every schoolboy knows the anecdote of the lad's swearing never to make peace with Rome. The the feeling grew with his years. When Hannibal was 24, Hasdrubal died, and he himself was unanimously elected his successor. Hamilcar had planned an invasion of Italy by way of the Alps, but the scheme was left inchoate at his death. Hannibal at once began definitely to pave the way for such an enterprise by completing the conquest of Spain. The original conception of crossing the Alps was Hamilcar's, just as Philip originally planned the invasion of Asia. But it was the fertile brain of Hannibal which gave the undertaking birth. The colossal nature of the plan, its magnificent daring, the boundless self-confidence and contempt of difficulty and danger which it implies, no less than the extraordinary manner of its execution, are equaled only by Alexander's setting forth, also but a lad, to conquer the illimitable possessions of the great king. In 3 years, BC 221 to 218, Hannibal had subjugated all Spain, and after a long siege captured Saguntum. He finally set out with 50,000 foot, 9,000 horse, and 37 elephants across the Pyrenees, whence his route was almost as unknown to him as the Atlantic to Columbus. It is impossible to follow him in this wonderful march, the first crossing of the Alps by any but isolated merchants, and probably the most daring enterprise ever set on foot. After toils and dangers impossible to gauge, even by the losses, Hannibal reached the Po in October, BC 218, with but 26,000 men and a few elephants, less than half the force with which he had left Spain. With this handful, he was to face a nation capable with its allies of raising 700,000 men. And yet the event, as well as our knowledge of Hannibal, shows that he had contemplated even this vast odds. But Rome was not ready. Hannibal gained numberless confederates among the Gauls in northern Italy, and that same fall and winter won 2 victories over the Romans at the Ticinus and Trebia. Next year, BC 217, he again defeated the Romans by an ambuscade at Lake Trasimene, killing or capturing their entire army of 30,000 men. These 3 victories were due to the over-eagerness of the Roman generals to fight, their careless methods, and Hannibal's skill in handling his troops and his aptness at stratagem. The campaign preceding, and the Battle of Lake Trasimene, taught the Romans 2 valuable lessons. The instruction given the world by Alexander had not reached self-important Republican Rome, though Hannibal was familiar enough with the deeds of the great Macedonian. The Romans knew nothing of war except crude, hard knocks. The first lesson showed them that there is something in the art of war beyond merely marching out to meet your enemy and beating him by numbers, better weapons, or greater discipline. It was thus. The Romans had retired into Etruria. In March BC 217, Hannibal, who was in Liguria, desired to cross the Apennines and move upon them. There were but 2 roads he could pursue. The highway would take him across the mountains, but by a long circuit. This was the route by which the consul Flaminius at Arretium, with his 40,000 men, was expecting him, and therefore the way Hannibal did not choose to march, for Flaminius could easily block the mountain roads. The other route was so difficult that Flaminius never dreamed that Hannibal knew of, or could by any possibility pursue it. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps had taught Flaminius nothing of his daring or his skill. This route lay along the coast to near the mouth of the Arnus, and thence up the right bank. It ran through an immense marsh, which, for an army, was all but as difficult an obstacle as the Alps. But it was the lesser evil and promised the greater results. And Hannibal chose it, as Napoleon did the great St. Bernard in 1800. No better description of the task can be given than to say that for 4 days and 3 nights the army marched through water where only the wagons, dead animals, or abandoned packs afforded the men any chance for rest. But the Carthaginian general reached his goal, turned Flaminius' left flank, and cut him off from Rome. Here was the conception of turning the enemy's strategic flank as clearly carried out as ever Napoleon did it. Such was Lesson 1. The result of this turning maneuver was the Battle of Lake Trasimene, where Hannibal taught the Romans, and us through them, the second lesson. The Romans had always marched in careless open order, without any idea of van or rear guard, or of flankers. This Hannibal knew. He placed his whole army in hiding at both ends of a defile at Lake Trasimene, through which the Romans must march, in such a manner that, when he made his attack, it was on an unsuspecting column, in front, rear, and one flank, and the lake being on the other flank, the result was utter annihilation. After this, the Romans marched with proper precautions. Hannibal had inflicted 3 staggering blows on his enemy, but Rome now appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius, truly surnamed Maximus and nicknamed Cunctator, because recognizing that he was not able to cope with Hannibal on the battlefield, he wisely chose to conduct a campaign of delays and small war. The one thing Hannibal could not afford, but also the one thing the Romans could not tolerate or understand. For the Romans had always won by crisp fighting. Still, it was the policy shaped by Fabius which eventually defeated Hannibal, and next to Hannibal himself, he was the best master the Romans then had. It is impossible, even slightly, to touch on many of Hannibal's campaigns and battles. I prefer to give a short description of the Battle of Cannae, which, in its conduct and results, is typical of Hannibal's methods. And first, a few words about the organization of either army. The Carthaginian discipline was based on the Macedonian idea, and the formation of the troops was phalangeal, that is, in close masses. But Hannibal's army contained troops of all kinds, from the Numidian horseman, whose only clothing was a tiger skin on his tough little runt of a pony, or the all-but-naked Gaul with his long, curved sword, to the Carthaginian heavy-armed hypaspist. All these diverse tribes had each its own manner of fighting, and it required a Hannibal to keep up discipline or tactical efficiency in such a motley force. The Roman army, on the contrary, was wonderfully homogeneous, carefully disciplined, in all parts organized and drilled in the same manner, and the legion was a body which was the very opposite of the phalanx. It had much more mobility, the individual soldiers were more independent in action, and instead of relying on one shock or on defense, the several lines could relieve each other and renew a failing battle 3 or even 4 times with fresh troops. After Trasimene, Hannibal not only armed his men with captured Roman weapons, but modified his organization somewhat to the legion pattern. The legion was at this time formed in 3 lines of maniples, or companies, placed checkerwise. In front were the hastati, the least efficient, behind this the princeps, and in the rear the triarii, or veterans. Each maniple was an excellent tactical unit. Each of these lines could relieve the other, and thus give a succession of hammer-like blows. The phalanx we already know, and while it was wonderful for one shock, it had no reserve, and if demoralization set in, it was gone. The tendency of formation in ancient days, as now, was towards greater mobility, and later on the Roman legion in Greece, particularly at Pydna, 168 BC, proved that it was superior, if properly handled, to the phalanx. In BC 216, Aemilius Paulus and Varro were consuls. The former was a man of high character and attainments. Varro came of plebeian stock, was overbearing and self-sufficient. The Roman and Carthaginian armies lay facing each other near the Aufidus, Hannibal backing on Cannae. His position here had been the result of an admirable maneuver. The consuls commanded on alternate days. There had been a serious combat on the last day of Varro's command, in which the Carthaginians had been outnumbered 2-1 and been defeated. This had greatly elated Varro and whetted his appetite for battle. He left the troops at evening in such a manner that next day his associate was badly placed. Aemilius scarcely wished to withdraw, lest his men should be disheartened. He could not remain where he was, as he was exposed to Hannibal's better cavalry. He took a middle course, on the whole unwise. He sent a third of his force to the north of the Aufidus, a trifle upstream, to sustain some foragers he had there, and make a secondary camp, from which to annoy Hannibal's parties in search of corn. This division of forces was very risky. Hannibal had long been trying to bring the consuls to battle, and now saw that the moment had come, for Varro was precipitate and would probably draw Aemilius into active measures. Each general made a stirring address to his army. Polybius gives both. Hannibal's has the true ring of the great captain. Let us hasten into action. I promise you victory, and, the gods willing, I will make my promise good. 2 days later, Hannibal offered Aemilius battle, but Aemilius declined it, and Hannibal sent his Numidians to the other side to annoy the Roman foragers. The succeeding day, knowing Varro to be in command, Hannibal again offered battle, aware that the hot-tempered Roman would be burning to avenge the yesterday's taunt. He left 8,000 men to guard his camp. There has been much discussion as to which bank of the Aufidus was the scene of the battle. It seems to me that the plan in the diagram comes nearest to fitting all the statements, however conflicting, of the several authorities. Near Hannibal's camp, the Aufidus makes a bold southerly sweep. Here, Hannibal forded the stream in 2 columns, drew up his army, and leaned his flanks on the river banks so as to prevent the Romans, with their numerical superiority, from overlapping them. His front he covered with archers and slingers so as to hide his formation from the Roman generals. Varro, as Hannibal anticipated, thought the Carthaginians were crossing to attack the lesser camp and leaving 11,000 men to guard the larger one, with orders to attack Hannibal's camp during the battle. He also crossed and drew up in the plain opposite the Carthaginians, he and every Roman in the ranks, craving to come to blows with the hated invaders. Varro also threw out his light troops in advance. He had 65,000 foot and 7,000 horse, to Hannibal's 32,000 foot and 10,000 horse. He could not overlap Hannibal's flanks, so he determined to make his line heavier and seek to crush him at the first impact. He changed the formation of the maniples so as to make them 16 men deep and 10 men front, instead of 16 men front by 10 deep, as usual. This was a grievous error. His men were unapt to maneuver or fight well in this unwanted form. He should have employed his surplus, say 25,000 men, as a reserve for emergencies. His army was in the usual 3 lines, 15 legions in all, the Roman on the right, the Allied on the left. The intervals between the maniples always equaled their front, and the distance between the lines the depth of the maniples. The Roman cavalry, 2,400 strong, was on the right. The Allied, 4,800 strong, on the left. It would have been better massed in one body, but such was the only formation then known. Aemilius commanded the right, Varro the left wing. Hannibal placed on his left, opposite the Roman cavalry, his heavy Spanish and Gallic horse, 8,000 strong, 2/3 in a first and 1/3 in a second line. This body was strong enough to crush the Roman horse, and thus cut off the retreat of the legions to their camps and towards Rome. In other words, Hannibal's fighting was to be forced on the Romans' strategic flank. He had a perfectly lucid idea of the value of a blow from this direction. On his right, facing the Allied cavalry, were his Numidians, 2,000 strong. Of the infantry, the Spaniards and Gauls were in the center in alternate bodies. His best troops, the African foot, he placed on their either flank. He expected these veterans to leaven the whole lump. The foot was all in phalanxes of 1,024 men each, the African foot in 16 ranks, as usual, the Spaniards and Gauls in 10. Hannibal had been obliged thus to make his center thin, from lack of men, but he had seething in his brain a maneuver by which he proposed to make this very weakness a factor of success. He had been on the ground and had seen Varro strengthen the Roman center. This confirmed him in his plan. Hannibal commanded the center in person, Hanno the right, Hasdrubal the left, Maharbal the cavalry of the left. Hannibal relied on Maharbal to beat the Roman cavalry, and then, riding by the rear of the Roman army, to join the Numidians on the Carthaginian right, like Coenus at the Hydaspes. His cavalry was superior in numbers and vastly outranked in effectiveness the Roman horse. Hannibal was, no doubt, familiar with Marathon. He proposed to better the tactics of that day. Remember that Miltiades had opposed to him Orientals. Hannibal faced Roman legions. His general plan was to withdraw his center before the heavy Roman line, to allow them to push it in, and then to enclose them in his wings and fall on their flanks. This was a highly dangerous maneuver, unless the withdrawal of the center could be checked at the proper time. But his men had the greatest confidence in him. The river in his rear would be an aid, if he could but keep his men steady, and in war no decisive result can be compassed without corresponding risk. Hannibal had fully prepared his army for this tactical evolution and rehearsed its details with all his subordinates. He not only had the knack of making his lieutenants comprehend him, but proposed to see to the execution of the work himself. The Carthaginians faced north, the Romans south. The rising sun was on the flank of either. The wind was southerly and blew the dust into the faces of the Romans. The light troops on either side opened the action and fiercely contested the ground for some time. During the preliminary fighting, Hannibal advanced his center, the Spanish and Gallic foot, in a salient or convex order from the main line, the phalanxes on the right and left of the central one being, it is presumed, in echelon to it. The wings of African foot kept their place. While this was being done, Hannibal ordered the heavy horse on his left to charge down on the Roman horse in their front. This they did with their accustomed spirit, but met a gallant resistance. The Roman knights fought for every inch with the greatest obstinacy when dismounted, continuing the contest on foot. The fighting was not by shocks, it was rather hand to hand. But the weight and superior training of the Carthaginian horse soon told. They rode down the Romans and crushed them out of existence. Emilius was badly wounded, but escaped the ensuing massacre and made his way to the help of the Roman center, hoping there to retrieve the day. On the Carthaginian right, the Numidians had received orders to skirmish with the allied horse and not come to a decisive combat till they should be joined by the heavy horse from the Carthaginian left. This they did in their own peculiar style, by riding around their opponents, squadron by squadron, and by making numberless feigned attacks. The battle in the center had not yet developed results when Maharbal, having destroyed the Roman cavalry and ridden around the Roman army, appeared in the rear of the allied horse. The Numidians now attacked seriously, and between them, in a few minutes, there was not a Roman horseman left upon the field alive. The Numidians were then sent in pursuit, Maharbal remaining upon the field. While this was going on, the light troops of both sides had been withdrawn through the intervals, and had formed in the rear and on the flanks of legion and phalanx, ready to fill gaps and supply the heavy foot with weapons. This had uncovered Hannibal's salient. Varro had committed still another blunder. In the effort to make his line so strong as to be irresistible, he had ordered his maniples of Principes from the second line forward into the intervals of the maniples of Hasti in first line, thus making one solid wall and robbing the legionaries of their accustomed mobility, as well as lending them a feeling of uncertainty in their novel formation. Still, with its wonted spirit, the heavy Roman line advanced on Hannibal's salient. The Carthaginian wings could not yet be reached, being so much refused. Striking the apex, the fighting became furious. Hannibal's salient, as proposed, began to withdraw, holding its own in good style. Varro, far too eager, and seeing, as he thought, speedy victory before him, was again guilty of the folly of ordering the third line, the Triarii, and even the light troops, up to the support of the already overcrowded first and second lines. The Carthaginian center, supported by its skirmishers, held the ground with just enough tenacity to whet the determination of the Romans to crush it. Varro now insanely ordered still more forces in from his wings to reinforce his center, already a mass so crowded as to be unable to retain its organization, but pressing back the Carthaginians by mere weight of mass. He could not better have played into Hannibal's hands. The Romans, 3 men in the place of 1, struggled onward, but became every moment a more and more jumbled body. Its maniple formation and consequent ease of movement was quite lost. Still, it pushed forward as if to certain victory, and still the Carthaginian salient fell back, till from a salient it became a line, from a line a re-entering angle or crescent. Hannibal, by great personal exertions, had in an extraordinary manner preserved the steadiness and formation of his center, though outnumbered 4-1. The Carthaginian wings he now ordered slowly to advance, which all the more edged the Roman center into the cul-de-sac Hannibal had prepared. The Roman legionaries were already shouting their eager cry of victory, but so herded together had they got that there was no room to use their weapons. Hannibal had kept the Carthaginian center free from any feeling of demoralization and ready at his command to turn and face the enemy. The wings, by their advance, had hustled the Roman legions into the form of a wedge without a vestige of maniple formation left. The decisive moment had come. Hannibal seized it with the eye of the born soldier. Arresting the backward movement of the center, which still had elbow room to fight, as the Romans had not, he gave the orders to the wings which they were impatiently awaiting. These veteran troops, in perfect order, wheeled inward to right and left, on the flanks of the struggling mass of legionaries. The Roman army was lost beyond a ray of hope, For at the same instant, Maharbal, having finished the destruction of the cavalry, rode down upon its rear. The cry of victory changed to a cry of terror. Defeat degenerated into mere slaughter. The Carthaginian cavalry divided into small troops and rode into the midst of the Roman soldiers, sabering right and left. Some squadrons galloped around to the flanks and lent a hand to the African phalanx in its butchery. No quarter was given, or indeed asked. The Romans died with their faces to the foe. The bloody work continued till but a handful was left. Livy and Polybius placed the killed at from 40 to 70,000 men. Varro had already escaped with a mere squad of horse. Aemilius Paulus died, sword in hand, seeking to stem the tide of disaster. 3 proconsuls, 2 quaestors, 21 military tribunes, a number of ex-consuls, praetors, and aediles, and 80 senators perished with the army. Hannibal's loss had been barely 6,000 men, but he had annihilated the splendid army of 87,000 men, the flower of Rome. It had vanished as if swallowed up in an earthquake. The battle had been won by crisp tactical skill and the most effective use of cavalry, as fine as that at the Hydaspes. It was indeed the gorgeous handling of the cavalry which made the infantry maneuver possible. Few battles in history are more marked by ability on the one side and crass blundering on the other than the Battle of Cannae. The handling of the cavalry was quite beyond praise. The manner in which the far from reliable Spanish and Gallic foot was advanced in a wedge in echelon and, under the meddlesome attack of the Roman legions, was first held there and then withdrawn step by step until it had reached the converse position of a re-entering angle and was then steadied in place by ordering up the light troops into its intervals. All this being done under the exultant Roman shouts of victory is a simple chef-d'oeuvre of battle tactics, due solely to Hannibal's magnificent personality, and the advance at the decisive instant of the African infantry and its wheel right and left upon the flanks of the disordered and overcrowded legionaries caps the masterstroke. The whole battle, from the Carthaginian standpoint, is a consummate piece of art, having no superior, few equals in the history of war. It is usual for historians to blame Hannibal for not at once marching on Rome after this victory. Let us see what his chances were. We have no hint of what he himself thought, of what his reasons were for not so doing. We must content ourselves with collecting a few guesswork items and endeavoring to argue as he did. 2 facts are peculiarly prominent in Hannibal's campaign in Italy. First, he had opposed to him the troops of the strongest and most intelligent military power of the world, some of which were, to be sure, comparatively raw in active duty, but yet trained to war from their youth, mixed with legionaries of many campaigns, and instinct with the ardor of fighting for their household gods. It is often assumed that Hannibal's troops were veterans, the Romans' levies of a day. During the first 3 years, this was in part true, and defeat had somewhat drawn the temper of the Roman blade. But throughout the rest of Hannibal's campaigns, the Roman army was much superior to his own in all but one quality, that strange influence which a great man exercises over men. It will be noticed that whenever the fighting was on equal terms, from the beginning, the Roman soldier gave a good account of himself. But Hannibal's victories were won by stratagem, or by tactical genius and skillful use of his cavalry arm, not by brute fighting. In the latter act, the legionary was fully the equal of the phalangite. One cannot compare the task of any other great captain with that of Hannibal. No one ever faced such odds. Secondly, Hannibal had calculated absolutely upon being able to detach the allies, the Socii, from their fealty. We cannot imagine him to have set out on his marvelous expedition without having made this the prime factor in his calculations. Hannibal was no madman. He was a keen, close calculator. But he would have been insane, indeed, if he had undertaken his hazardous campaign without such expectation. He was well justified in reckoning on such defection. There had always been a good deal of opposition to high-handed Rome among all her allies, municipal cities, and colonies, and it was a fair assumption that many, if not most of them, would be glad to free themselves and humble their proud conqueror and mistress. In this expectation, Hannibal had been entirely disappointed. None of the Socii, who were the brawn of the Roman body, had shown any disposition to meet him otherwise than with the sword, None of the colonies, except in distant Gaul, had met him even halfway. He had captured towns and territory and had garrisoned citadels. But the aid he received was not that which enables a conqueror to hold what he takes except with a strong hand. And without just such aid, Hannibal could not only not win, but could not be otherwise than defeated in his contest with the mighty Republic. To assume that Hannibal did not see all this, and that he was not fighting against hope almost from the second year, is to underrate this man's intellectual ability. No one ever fathomed Hannibal's purpose. He was so singularly reticent that Roman historians called him perfidious, because no one could, from his face or conduct, gauge either his thought or intention or calculate upon his acts. He had no Hephaestion as had Alexander. But no doubt he was keenly alive to the failure so far of his calculation on the disaffection of the allies. And now, after the overwhelming victory of Cannae, he had to weigh not only the strategic and tactical difficulties, but the still more serious political ones. If the allies, or a good part of them, could be induced to join his cause, Rome would fall sooner or later. If not, he could never take Rome, nor permanently injure the Roman cause. The chances were, in a military sense, all against his capturing Rome by a coup de main. Rome was over 200 miles distant, well-walled, and with a large force which could be quietly gathered to protect it. If he failed, the game was lost. It was far wiser for him to still try to influence the Allies, which he could now do with a record of wonderful victories such as the world had not yet seen. Hannibal was not a military gambler. He never risked his all on a bare chance, as some other soldiers have done. He always reckoned his chances closely, and every reason prompted him not to risk the loss of his all on the chances of a brilliant march on the enemy's capital, which had only its boldness to commend it, and every military reason, as well as the stanch Roman heart, to promise failure as its result. For there was no obsequious satrap to open its gates and welcome the conquering hero, as it had been Alexander's fortune to meet. If Hannibal marched on Rome, he must be prepared to besiege the city, and he had neither siege equipment, nor were sieges consonant with his peculiar ability. If the story be true that Maharbal asked of Hannibal, after Cannae, that he might march on Rome with 5,000 horse, promising that he should sup in the capital in 4 days, and that on Hannibal's declining, Maharbal exclaimed, "Truly, Hannibal, thou knowest how to win a victory, but knowest not how to use one." It may tend to show that Maharbal possessed indeed the daring recklessness of a true general of cavalry, but it also proves that Hannibal had the discretion, as he had shown in abundant measure the enterprise, of the great captain. Hannibal probably at this time harbored the hope that after this fourth and overwhelming defeat of the Romans, the allies would finally see that their interests lay with him. In fact, Capua, the Samnites, Lucanians, and many cities of Lower Italy did join his cause, and the unexplained time which he spent in the vicinity of his late battlefield was no doubt devoted to political questions, the favorable solution of which could be better brought about by not for the moment risking his now unquestioned military supremacy. The institutions and laws which gave Rome strength never demonstrated her greatness so well as now. The people which had created these institutions, which had made these laws, never rose superior to disaster, never exhibited the strength of character of which the whole world bears the impress, so well as now. The horrible disaster to both state and society, for there was not a house in which there was not one dead, by no means changed the determination of the Roman people, however horrified the cool-headed, however frightened the many. Not that among the ignorant there was not fear and trembling, but it was not the ignorant who had made or ruled Rome. The more intelligent and courageous element spoke with a single voice. The praetors at once called the Senate together to devise means of defense, and it remained in constant session. All Rome was in affliction, but this must not interfere with the necessity of saving the city, and courage must be outward as well as in the heart. The word peace was forbidden to be pronounced. Mourning was limited to 30 days. Tears were prohibited to women in public. New energies were at once put at work. In view of the alarming circumstances and the impossibility of carrying out the requirements of the law, the Senate itself made M. Junius Para dictator, who chose Titus Sempronius Gracchus as master of cavalry. The entire male population above 17 years of age was enrolled. 4 new legions and 1,000 horse were added to the city garrison. All mechanics were set to work to repair weapons. The walls were already in a state of excellent defense. The Senate purchased and armed 8,000 slaves and 4,000 debtors or criminals, with promise of freedom and pardon. Naught but stubborn resistance to the last man was thought of. It was indeed well that Hannibal did not march on Rome. Cannae was the last great victory of Hannibal, but the beginning of his most masterly work. He had up to this moment conducted a brilliant offensive. There is nothing in the annals of war which surpasses his crossing of the Alps, his victories at the Ticinus and Trebia, his march through the Arnus marshes, his victory at Lake Trasimene, his maneuvers up to Cannae, and that wonderful battle. But this splendid record had not helped his cause. Yet, against all hope, he stuck to his task for 13 long years more, waiting for reinforcements from Carthage, or for some lucky accident which might turn the tide in his favor. Up to Cannae fortune had smiled upon him. After Cannae she turned her back on him, never again to lend him aid. Livy asserts that Hannibal's want of success came from his exposing his troops to a winter in Capua, where debauch destroyed their discipline. Many historians have followed this theory, but the soldier who looks at the remarkable work done by Hannibal from this time on knows that nothing short of the most exemplary discipline can possibly account for it, and seeks his reasons elsewhere. Livy's statements will bear watching. Hannibal soon became too weak to afford the attrition of great battles. He had sought to impose on the allies by brilliant deeds. He had failed, and must put into practice whatever system would best carry out his purpose. From this time on, he avoided fighting unless it was forced upon him, but resorted to maneuvering to accomplish his ends. He seized important towns, he marched on the Roman communications, he harassed the enemy with small war. He did the most unexpected and surprising things. He appeared at one end of southern Italy before the enemy had any idea that he had left the other. He was teaching the Romans the trade of war. They were not slow to see wherein Hannibal's superiority lay, and profited by it. He educated their best generals, and these now came to the front. The Romans raised annually from 150,000 to 240,000 men, of which 1/2 to 2/3 were in Hannibal's own front, and they were of the bone and sinew of Rome. He himself never had more than 35,000 to 40,000 effective, and these far from as good. The Carthaginian Senate, under lid of the Hanno faction, forsook him, nor sent him men nor money except one small reinforcement. He was cast on his own resources in the enemy's country. While the Roman legions grew in numbers and experience, his own veterans gradually disappeared and left but a ragged force behind. And yet, during most of this time, he marched over the length and breadth of Italy, ravaging and destroying, and not one nor all the Roman armies could prevent him from acting out his pleasure. Among all the brilliant lessons in strategy which Hannibal gave the Romans, there is time but to mention one more. Capua, one of the large cities of Italy, had embraced Hannibal's cause as the coming man. But Hannibal had, in BC 211, been crowded back into southern Italy, and the Romans were besieging Capua. He was called upon for aid. The Capuans were in sorry plight. Hannibal, who was blockading the citadel at Tarentum, left this pressing affair to answer their appeal, made a secret forced march, eluding the 4 consular legions in Apulia and at Beneventum, and suddenly appeared before the astonished Roman army at Capua, intent on raising the siege. The Capuans and Carthaginians attacked the Roman lines at the same time, but both recoiled from superior numbers and entrenched position. Hannibal, seeing that he could not raise the siege by direct means, tried, for the first time in the history of strategy, an indirect means, hoping to effect by moral weight what he could not by weight of men. He marched straight on Rome. He counted on the proconsuls, from fear for their capital, to raise the siege of Capua and follow him. He knew he could not capture Rome, where were forces much larger than his own, but he ravaged the land to its very gates and filled the city with affright. Hannibal had, however, taught his pupils much too well. Rome was terribly demoralized and called lustily for the proconsul's armies to come from Capua to its aid. But these generals were not to be misled. They by no means relaxed their grip, and Hannibal lost the game. At an earlier stage of the war, this brilliant movement would certainly have raised the siege of Capua. Finally, Hannibal became so reduced in numbers that he was compelled to remain in the extreme south of Italy. He could not move out of Bruttium. His forces were quite unequal to fighting or even campaigning. He was hoping against hope for some kind of recognition from home, some aid in men and material. He could undertake nothing, but clung to what he held with a despairing grasp. Weak as he was, however, no Roman consul chose to come within reach of his arm. His patience and constancy under these trials, and the dread his name still inspired, show him up in far greater measure than any of his triumphs. Even Livy, who is full of depreciation of Hannibal's abilities, says, "The Romans did not provoke him while he remained quiet. Such power did they consider that single general possessed, though everything else around him was falling into ruin," and is compelled to follow up this statement with a panegyric. For a dozen years, Hannibal had held more or less territory in the midst of the Roman Empire, far from home and his natural base. His old army had quite disappeared, and a motley array of the most heterogeneous materials had taken its place. He had for 3 or 4 years past had nothing which he could oppose to the Roman legions without danger of, without actual defeat. His troops had often neither pay nor clothing, rations were scant, their arms were far from good. They must have foreseen eventual disaster, as did Hannibal. And yet the tie between leader and men never ceased to hold. The few soldiers he had were all devotion to his cause. Driven into a corner where he must subsist his army on a limited area, which he could only hold by forcing under his standard every man possibly fit for service, among a people whose greed for gold and plunder was their chief characteristic, he was still able not only to keep his phalanxes together, but to subject them to excellent discipline. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, were only dreaming of holding on to Spain. Their one useful captain, with all his possibilities, they were blindly neglecting. He was left absolutely to his own resources. And yet it is so wonderful that one can but repeat it again and again, though there were several armies of Roman veteran legions. For nearly all Roman soldiers were veterans now. Around him on every side, such was the majesty which hedged his name, that neither one singly nor all together dared to come to the final conflict with him, brave and able though their leaders were. Even after the Metaurus, when the Romans knew what the effect of his brother's defeat must be on the morale of Hannibal's army, if not on himself, this dread of the very name of Hannibal, even by the best of the Roman generals, is almost inexplicable. They must each and all have recognized that it needed but one joint effort to crush out his weakened and depleted semblance of an army, and yet none of them was apparently willing to undertake the task. Whatever the Roman historians may tell us about these years is not here really a great and stubborn fact, which testifies to more than 1,000 pages penned by his detractors. Finally, long after Hasdrubal had made his way to Italy and had been defeated by the consul Nero, Rome carried the war into Africa, and Hannibal was recalled from Italy and defeated at Zama by Scipio. It was, however, neither Scipio nor Zama that defeated Hannibal. The Carthaginian cause had been doomed years before. It was inanition, pure and simple, which brought Hannibal's career to a close, the lack of support of the Carthaginian Senate. He all but won Zama, even with the wretched material he had brought from Italy, and without cavalry against the best army Rome had so far had, the most skillful general, and every fair chance. Had he won Zama, he must have lost the next battle. The Semitic cause against the Arian was bound to fail. This battle ended the war. Hannibal lived 19 years after the defeat, for 6 years in Carthage, 13 in exile. Rome never felt secure until his death. Hannibal ranks with the few great captains of the world. Alexander, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Frederick, Napoleon alone can stand beside him. In this galaxy, the stars are equal. His self-reliant courage, which prompted him to undertake the conquest of Italy with 20,000 foot and 6,000 horse, without a definite base and with uncertain confederates, is the mark which stamps the genius or the fool. Without the ability and iron resolution to do so vast a thing, no great man ever accomplished results. Upon such a rock have been shattered many reputations. Hannibal had remarkable control over men. Reaching Cisalpine Gaul, it was but a few weeks before the whole province became his sworn allies, and they remained true and faithful to his cause, and bore their heavy burden with cheerful alacrity, though then as now, the most unstable of peoples. Hannibal possessed a keen knowledge of human nature, as well as an unbounded individual power over men. Unfortunately, only a few anecdotes remain to us as the portrait of this extraordinary man, but we cannot doubt that he carried that personal magnetism with him which lent a wonderful strength to what he said or did. His victories were as brilliant as any ever won, but on these does not rest his chief glory. When he won Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, he had opposed to him generals ignorant of the art of war, which art the genius of Hannibal enabled him to use in a manner beyond all others, and which his experience in many arduous campaigns had taught him to the bottom. But Hannibal instructed these same Romans in this very art of war, and his later opponents fought him on his own system, and with wonderful aptness at learning what he had instilled into them with such vast pains. These scholars of Hannibal, however, able as they became, never in any sense grew to their master's stature. They were strong in numbers and courage, they surrounded him on all sides, they cut off his reinforcements and victuals, they harassed his outposts and foragers, they embarrassed his marches, all in the superb style he had shown them how to use. But, for all that, though outnumbering him many to one, not one or several of them could ever prevent his coming or going, at his own good time or pleasure, whithersoever he listed, and never was more than a momentary advantage gained over him in a pitched battle till the fatal day of Zama. Even after Hasdrubal's death, his aggressors dared not attack him. Like a pack of bloodhounds around the boar at bay, none ventured to close in on him for a final struggle. Even when he embarked for Carthage, the most dangerous of operations possible for an army, it was not attempted to hamper his progress. Even Scipio in Italy seemed by no means anxious to encounter him, except at a disadvantage, and in Africa did not meet him until he could do so on his own conditions and under the very best of auspices. By some, Scipio has been thought equal to Hannibal. But great soldier as Scipio was, he falls very far short of the rank attained by Hannibal. The list of generals of a lesser grade numbers many great names, among them that of Scipio, linked with commanders like Brasidas, Epaminondas, Xenophon, Prince Eugene, Turenne, Marlborough, Montecuculi. But between these and men of the stamp of Hannibal there is a great gulf fixed. Like all great captains, Hannibal not infrequently violated what we now call the maxims of war. But when he did so, it was always with that admirable calculation of the power or weakness of the men and forces opposed to him, which, of itself, is the excuse for the act by that man who is able to take advantage of, as well as to make circumstances. All great captains have a common likeness in this respect. Napoleon aptly says, "The principles of Caesar were the same as those of Alexander or Hannibal, to hold his forces in hand, to be vulnerable on several points only when it is unavoidable, to march rapidly upon the important points, to make use to a great extent of all moral means, such as the reputation of his arms, the fear he inspires, the political measures calculated to preserve the attachment of allies and the submission of conquered provinces." Such men have used the maxims of war only so far as they fitted into their plans and combinations. Success justifies them, but the failure of the lesser lights who infringe these maxims only proves them to be maxims indeed. What has Hannibal done for the art of war? First and foremost, he taught the Romans what war really is, that there is something beyond merely marching out, fighting a battle, and marching home again. He showed them that with but a small part of their numerical force, with less good material, with less good arms, with but a few allies, he could keep Rome on the brink of ruin and despair for 2/3 of a generation. He showed them for 13 years that he could accomplish more than they could, despite their numbers, and without battle. And while battle should be always the legitimate outcome of all military maneuvers, Hannibal taught the Romans that there was something far higher in war than mere brute weight, and through the Romans he has taught us. Hannibal was as typically a fighter as even Alexander, though he preferred to prescribe his own time and conditions. But all through Alexander's campaigns, it happened that the results he aimed at could be accomplished only by hammering, and he had the power to hammer. Hannibal, on the contrary, found that he could not stand attrition, that he must save men. Alexander was constantly seeking conquests. Hannibal, like Frederick, only to keep what he had won, and in doing this, he showed the world the first series of examples of intellectual war. Alexander's strategy, in its larger aspect, was as far-seeing and far-reaching as that of any of the great captains, and he was the first to show it. But Alexander's strategic movements had not been understood and ran danger of being lost. Hannibal was, probably, the only man who understood what Alexander had done, and he impressed his own strategy so thoroughly upon the Romans that it modified their whole method of waging war. Alexander's strategy was equally marked. Like Caesar's, his strategic field was the whole known world. But he did not exhibit that more useful phase of strategy on a smaller theater, which Hannibal has given us. While Hannibal's movement into Italy was offensive, the years after Cannae partook largely of the defensive. He was holding his own till he could get reinforcements from home or the help of the Roman allies. And yet it was he who was the mainspring, which furnished the action, the center about which everything revolved. Perhaps there is no surer test of who is the foremost soldier of a campaign than to determine who it is upon whose action everything waits, who it is that forces the others to gauge their own by his movements. And this Hannibal always did. It made no odds whether it was in his weak or his strong years. It was Hannibal's marching to and fro, Hannibal's maneuvers, offensive or defensive, which predetermined the movements of the Roman armies. We know little about the personal appearance of Hannibal. We only know that in the march through the Arnus swamps, he lost an eye. In the British Museum is an ancient bust of a soldier with but one eye, by some supposed to be Hannibal, but there is no authentic likeness of the man. It is improbable that he possessed Alexander's charm of beauty. But in all his other qualities, mental and physical, he was distinctly his equal, and in his life he was simple, pure, and self-contained. Alexander did brilliant things for their own sake. Hannibal always forgot self in his work. Alexander needed adulation. Hannibal was far above such weakness. Alexander was open, hasty, violent. His fiery nature often ran away with his discretion. Hannibal was singularly self-poised. From his face you could never divine his thought or intention. So marked was this ability to keep his own counsel, never to betray his purpose, that the Roman historians talked of deception when he did unexpected things. But Punic faith was distinctly as good as Roman faith. The Romans promised and did not perform. Hannibal never promised. Hannibal's mind was broad, delicate, clear. His Greek training made him intellectually the superior of any of the Roman generals. His conception of operations and discrimination in means were equaled by his boldness, even obstinacy, of execution. Hannibal's influence over men is perhaps his most wonderful trait. Alexander commanded fealty as a king, as well as won it as a man. Hannibal earned the fidelity and love of his men by his personal qualities alone. When we consider the heterogeneous elements of which his army was composed, the extraordinary hardships it underwent, the hoping against hope, the struggling against certain defeat and eventual annihilation, the toils and privation, and remember that there was never a murmur in his camp or a desertion from his ranks, and that eventually he was able to carry his army, composed almost entirely of Italians, over to Africa on the most dangerous of tasks, and to fight them as he did at Zama. It may be said that Hannibal's ability to keep this body together and fit for work shows the most wonderful influence over men ever possessed by man. Alexander always had luck running in his favor. Hannibal is essentially the captain of misfortune. Alexander was always victorious, Hannibal rarely so in battle in the last 12 years in Italy. Alexander fought against a huge but unwieldy opponent, brave but without discipline and top-heavy. Hannibal's work was against the most compact and able nation of the world, at its best period, the very type of a fighting machine. Not that all this in any sense makes Hannibal greater than Alexander, but it serves to heighten the real greatness of Hannibal. Hannibal's marches were quick, secret, crafty. He was singularly apt at guessing what his enemy would do, and could act on it with speed and effect. He was unsurpassed in logistics. The Romans learned all they ever knew of this branch of the art from Hannibal. Despite the tax upon him, his men always had bread. He utilized his victories well, but was not led astray by apparent, though delusive, chances. As a besieger, Hannibal was not Alexander's equal. Only Demetrius and Caesar, perhaps, were. In this matter, Hannibal and Frederick were alike. Both disliked siege work. But as a man, so far as we can know him, and if he had any vices, his enemies, the Roman historians, would have dilated upon them, Hannibal was perhaps, excepting Gustavus Adolphus, the most admirable of all. As a captain, he holds equal rank with the others. As a distinguishing mark, we may well call him the father of strategy.
This concludes today's reading of Great Captains by Theodore A, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.